Welcome to this edition of Cranmer Readings. We pick up with Jasper Ridley and the crisis of 1543 with the Prebendaries Plot that nearly took Cranmer down had Henry not intervened. The Wily Winchester, Stephen Gardiner had a hand in it. So we pick up there on page 242 of Jasper Ridley's Thomas Cranmer. But Cranmer showed no lack of energy when he went into his diocese in middle September 1543 to investigate the case in person. He pursued his inquiries at Canterbury, Beaksbourne, and Faversham until the end of November, examining the prebendaries and parsons and many other persons, and learning of lights before images, of fasting on the eve of the abrogated holy days, of royal injunctions defied and improper statements made in sermons, and of failure to expunge the name of bishop from the prayer books. The notes which he made in the margin of the depositions which he wrote down show that he was not disposed to be lenient in this case. This is not surprising, for the conduct of the culprits amounted to a defiance of the king's injunctions, and Maurice writes that although Cranmer was always ready to relent where his own interests were concerned, in matters which touched the prince he was stout and inexorable. Cranmer wrote seditious opposite such statements as, "The people have not hitherto had good wine of God's word, but a day would come that they should have good wine again." And as Christ was accused by 2 or 3 false knaves, so a man may be accused by 2 or 3 false knaves, and the judge as false a knave as best, and so condemned. These statements had been made by Canon Gardiner in a sermon in the Cathedral, but Cranmer was equally stern with reformers who had offended. He made a note that a statement that the Mass and the Dirge were not laudable was offensive, and recorded that a man of Headcorn possessed books by Tyndale and Frith. Oh, horrors, no. Despite the defeat of the Prebendaries Plot, the Conservatives were still in the ascendant in 1543. Several of the Orthodox Prebendaries and their fellow conspirators were imprisoned for a time and compelled to write letters of submission to Cranmer, entreating his forgiveness for having trespassed against him. But the next session of Parliament, January 1544, a statute of pardons was passed, of which they were able to take advantage. The reformers were more severely dealt with. In July, 3 sacramentaries were burned in the park at Windsor, though Henry pardoned the musicians of his household who'd been associated with them. One reformer wryly commented that the king had burned these men in order to celebrate his marriage to Catherine Parr, which had just taken place. In the Diocese of Canterbury, 2 priests were proceeded against for heresy at the sessions of the 6 Articles in September 1543. One of them, Richard Turner, whom Maurice had appointed as curate in the parsonage of Chartham, which Cranmer had granted him. Turner had been denounced some 6 months before by some Orthodox prebendaries for having preached against ceremonies, and was examined at Lambeth by Cranmer. The propriety of Turner's sermon was vouched for by Sir Thomas Moyle, Speaker of the House of the Commons, who was sufficiently orthodox for him to be approached by the prebendaries when they were preparing articles accusing Cranmer of heresy. In view of Moyle's attitude, Cranmer could hardly fail to discharge Turner. The people of Chartham prepared a great reception for Turner on his return from Lambeth. But Turner, realizing that this would be made grounds of a fresh complaint by the Conservatives, left the highway and walked home 18 miles through the woods in order to avoid a demonstration of sympathy. This did not prevent the Conservatives from reporting that demonstration had taken place, and Henry, in anger, ordered that Turner should again be brought before Cranmer, who was now in Canterbury investigating the Prebendaries Plot. Henry told Cranmer to have Turner whipped out of the county. Maurice intervened with Cranmer on Turner's behalf, but Cranmer refused his help because he feared that he would be accused of protecting heretics. Maurice then asked Cranmer's permission to appear before the council, along with witnesses from Chartham, to prove that no public banquet had been held when Turner returned home. But Cranmer forbade him to do this or to make any move to arrange for witnesses from Chartham to give evidence for Turner. All that Cranmer would permit was that Maurice might make private approaches to his influential friends at court, and on 2 November 1543, Maurice wrote to Denny and Butts about Turner. Maurice was a loyal servant to Cranmer and always found the most favorable explanation of his master's bias in favor of the papists and against Protestants. But he was unable to obscure the fact that Cranmer's conduct in this case was contemptible. As for my Lord of Canterbury, he wrote, he dare nothing do for the poor man's delivery. He hath done so much for him already, and his grace hath told me plainly that it is put into the king's head that he is the maintainer and supporter of all heretics within the realm, nor will he permit me or my neighbors to resort unto the council for his purgation while he was at Chartham, saving only I have obtained this at his hand, that I may become a suitor in writing to my friends and good masters at court for his delivery. Butts chose an opportune moment when Henry was with his barber to mention the matter to him, and Henry ordered the proceedings against Turner to be quashed. The physician thus succeeded where the primate dared not to tread. Cranmer had shown such courage in intervening for Henry's papist daughter and for Fisher and Moore and the Carthusians, did not raise a hand to protect the reformer in his diocese when his own secretary could prove that the man was innocent. And if Maurice's intervention at court had been unsuccessful, Cranmer would have undoubtedly punished Turner in the full knowledge of his innocence. Cranmer had succeeded in retaining a few remnants of his integrity during the crisis of 1540, but he was forced to abandon them in the face of the perils of 1543. The new policy, the death of Henry, chapter 16. On 18 December 1543, Cranmer's palace at Canterbury was burned. Several persons lost their lives in the fire, including Cranmer's brother-in-law, who was probably the miller who'd married that sister of Cranmer, who was said to have committed bigamy. Cranmer was still in residence at the time, and Harpsfield's story of the chest relates to this question. According to Fox, Cranmer alone remained calm during the fire and bore the disaster with equanimity and unchanging countenance. Owing to the fire, he was unable to entertain Gonzaga, the commander of the Emperor's army in France, who was traveling to London for discussions on military operations and was therefore ordered by the council to return immediately to court in order that Lord Cobham, as the highest magnate remaining in Canterbury, should be free to receive Gonzaga. The councillors did not consider it necessary in their letter to Cranmer to express any sympathy for the loss which he had suffered in the fire. 1544 was a glorious year for English arms. Hertford was ravaging Scotland, fighting the war in such a way as to inflict the greatest possible suffering on the people, and burning the monasteries which he passed. For the war against Scotland was waged as a war against popery. This did not prevent some of the reformers from being shocked at the English atrocities. John Hooper wrote to Bullinger that he shuddered at the devastation which Hertford had inflicted on the Scots. But Cranmer could only write letters with his fellow councillors to Hertford, transmitting the king's order to him to put Edinburgh to fire and sword, without taking either the castle or town to mercy, though they would yield. The councillors did, however, suggest that the Scottish prisoners of lower rank were starving in the English prisons. They might be granted some small relief if extreme necessity should so require. If the war against Scotland was a war against popery, the war against France had begun as a war of the defense of the Catholic community against the ally of the Turk. But Charles's separate peace with France had altered this position, and this, though had a disastrous effect on the military situation, was of the great benefit to the Reformation in England. If Henry had been fighting as an ally of the emperor, it is unlikely that he would have ordered prayers for the success of his campaign to be held in English instead of Latin, and have initiated the measures which were the beginning of the great new venture, the imposition of church services in the English language. On 11 June 1544, Henry ordered that the litany, or processions as it was usually named, for it was sung by the priest and people as they walked in procession through the church or streets, should henceforth be sung in English. The English version, which had already been published before the end of May, introduced changes not only in the language but in the substance. The invocation of 58 saints in the old pre-Reformation litany had been replaced by the prayers to 38 saints in Bishop Hilsey's Manual of Prayers of 1539. And the English litany now surreptitiously abolished the invocation of saints altogether by substituting a general appeal to saints along with patriarchs and prophets. By October 1545, Cranmer had drafted a new litany for festival days and English verse translations of some of the Latin anthems, though he was not satisfied with the poetic quality of his verse. Meanwhile, in May 1545, a primer was published which contained a number of innovations and included not only the litany of 1544, but also a new version of the Office of Hours, which was considerably shorter than the old version. It has always been assumed that Cranmer was the author of all these publications, and though there is no evidence that he was connected with any of them except the litany for festival days, it's highly probable that he was not only responsible for their publication, but that he actually drafted them. We have no record that Cranmer had until now shown any interest in the question of prayers in the vernacular tongue, but this was an important tenet in the Lutheran doctrines, and in view of Cranmer's enthusiasm for the English Bible, there is little doubt that some years he had favored services in English. and that he now won a victory for his benefits in the only way he wished to win victories, not by disobedience or surreptitious trickery, but by convincing his prince in a private and theological discussion that this was the course which God required him to pursue. Cranmer was active in the temporal government of the country, as in drafting liturgies. When Henry led his armies to the siege of Boulogne in July 1544, Cranmer, who entertained him to dinner at Ford on his last day in England, was appointed one of the members of the Council of Catherine and Parr during Henry's absence. Cranmer was in a constant attendance upon the Queen, traveling with her in progress through Surrey and Kent, and staying with her for a time as a guest at his old palace at Hertford. In the autumn of 1544, he was one of the commissioners appointed to grant to various gentlemen and speculators the monastic lands which had not yet been disposed of, for it had been decided to sell these lands in order to raise money for the war. This was yet another instance in which Cranmer was employed in a transaction of which he had originally disapproved. Next summer, when the French were expected to land at Thanet, Cranmer played his part at Beaksbourne in his preparations against invasion in which the whole population of Kent was engaged. He urged the council to place artillery on the cliffs, and his suggestion was duly referred to Sir Thomas Seymour, who was at Dover in command of the defense forces. He also provided shelter and medical and financial assistance for the wounded soldiers who were traveling through Beaksbourne on their way home from Boulogne, which had been captured in the previous year and added, along with a number of villages, to Cranmer's diocese. Cranmer, who had been regularly engaged since 1533 as a commissioner for raising revenue, both from ecclesiastics and laymen in Kent, and in convocation had played the foremost part, to the disgust of the more extreme reformers, in repeatedly offering voluntary gifts of money from the clergy to the king. Now that Henry had deliberately debased the currency in order to enrich himself at his subjects' expense, there was increasing reluctance to pay taxes. An alderman of London who failed to pay was conscripted into the army, and another alderman who criticized the text was sent to the fleet. Yet Cranmer in his litany ordered the people to pray for our most dear and sovereign Lord, the King's Majesty, who doth not only study and care daily and hourly for our prosperity and wealth, but also spareth not to spend his sustenance and treasure, yea, ready at all times to endanger himself for the tender love and fatherly zeal that he beareth toward this realm and subjects. The taxation was particularly resented by those impoverished persons who had yet not been paid for the corn which they provided for the army, but were nevertheless expected to pay taxes to the king. The end of the war, June 1546, Cranmer wrote to the council with regard to the hardship of these persons, referring also to the resistance to taxation in the Cinque Ports and the difficulties of the newly appointed clergy who were expected to pay their first fruits to the king, a special contribution for the war. Cranmer received a stern reply from Wriothesley in Norfolk. He must make the Cinque Ports pay. He must make the new incumbents pay both first fruits and contribution. And as for unpaid suppliers of the army, he was told that such regard for the poor men's necessities was not expedient. And we bring that here to a close. As we turn to Professor MacCulloch on Cranmer, and we pick up on page 283, salvaging the cause. Give me a second here. Resituate. Sorry about that. Later in the year, these successes continued, directed now against the world of saints and shrines, which seemed so important in Cromwell's attack on the religious past. In July, Cranmer drew up a further modification of the number of saints' days to be observed, which was turned with the king's approval into a royal proclamation. The status of St. Luke's, St. Mark's, and St. Mary Magdalene feasts was confirmed on the biblical humanist ground that these worthies were often and many times mentioned in plain and manifest scripture. At the same time, the proclamation abolished ceremonials of ritual inversion held by many parishes on certain holy days, when boys were dressed up as bishops to preach and preside over mock liturgies. Perhaps most significantly, the feast days celebrating the Empress Helena's supposed discovery of the true cross was abolished, together with another feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross. Although the abolition was justified on pragmatic grounds in relationship to harvest time and complications in the Easter law term, this was a deliberately intended blow to the cult of the rood, which was still one of the most prominent objects of devotion in the churches, soaring above every chancel screen with a row of flickering candles beneath it. In the autumn, the coup de grace was given to the remaining shrines in England. Royal letters were sent to the archbishops of both provinces, ordering their destruction, in order finally paid publicly tolerated cults of holy places, except in the most remote parts of England. Cranmer could also seize an unusual number of opportunities to place his friends and dependents in useful positions in spring 1541, a substantial boost to his habitual preferment of evangelical clergy. Opportune deaths meant that during April, he could at last appoint his intimate friend John Whitwell to the parish church beside the palace gate at Lambeth, reward his equally long-standing friend Richard Astall with a comfortable prebend at Wingham College, and put John Gibbs into the parish of the northern home of Croydon. During May, a resignation made the rich living of Great Chart available for Dr. Richard Thornton, a long-standing protege of Cranmer's, although Thornton later proved a false friend. Additionally, the refoundation of Canterbury Cathedral was finally completed in April. Besides some appointments which were highly unsatisfactory from his point of view, Cranmer could welcome among the 12 Prebendaries his chaplains Richard Champion and Nicholas Ridley, plus his Calais commentary Hugh Glazier and Richard Thornton. 3 out of his newly instituted 6 Prebendaries were deliberately chosen by him as representatives of what conservatives scornfully term New Learning. Nicholas Ridley's cousin Lancelot Ridley, Michael Drum, and John Scory. Scory started as he meant to go on by preaching in the cathedral on 27 March 1541 about justification by faith, reportedly saying in his sermon that he that doth deny that only faith justify would deny, if durst be so bold, that Christ doth justify. His new conservative colleagues started as they meant to go on by making notes of what he said. It was surprising that very quickly this uncomfortable mix of opinions on the cathedral staff provoked major trouble, with wildly discordant messages coming out of the pulpit both in cathedral and surrounding parish churches. The preaching of Scory and Lancelot Ridley during May became the subject of a formal complaint to Cranmer by conservative prebendaries Richard Parkhurst and Arthur Legger, former prior of Reeds and brother to the equally conservative Kentish magnate Sir Anthony Legger. No harm came to Scory or Ridley, and it seems to have been on this occasion that Cranmer snarled at Prebendary St. Ledger, "You make a band, do you? I will break your band, and I will make you leave. Mumpsimus." The Archbishop had clearly not got over his annoyance at the defeat of his vision for the cathedral and the large contingent of conservatives which still infested it as a result. It would have been impossible for him to appease an honest broker in the arguments which continued to proliferate. This became clear when, within only 2 months of this cathedral's new foundation, on June 12, 1541, Cranmer felt it necessary to travel to Canterbury to sort out the arguments among the Canterbury staff. At this meeting, the Archbishop became embroiled in a row about devotion to images with 2 more conservatives, the new prebendary and ex-monk William Gardiner, alias Sandwich, and the former Oxford don turned 6 preacher Robert Serles. This ended with Cranmer snapping at them that their distinction between a pejorative meaning of idol for the Greek Adon and an acceptable sense for the Latin imago was entirely false. The conservatives complained about the policy of exact balance in choosing the 6 preachers. "It is a mean to set us at variance," protested Gardiner, who remained unconvinced of Cranmer's insistence that all the choice had been his. The king's pleasure is to have it so. The atmosphere of dissension in the cathedral was mirrored in the city as a whole. With the same summer, and perhaps at the same time, Cranmer called on to arbitrate in a bitter argument about whether or not an alderman had properly been dismissed from office. That dispute also had a religious dimension, and the Archbishop's intervention was equally unsuccessful in ending trouble, which escalated into a Star Chamber case. Cranmer continued to look on Robert Serles as a major dissenter among new appointments. The hostility, which was warmly reciprocated by a man who had at first come to the diocese as an incumbent in the living of St. Augustine's Abbey. It was Serles who first tried the tactic which was used in a major campaign against the Archbishop in 1543. In September 1541, he traveled up to York to present complaints against Cranmer directly to the king. The plan backfired. Henry was kept from seeing his articles of complaint, and Serles' interview with the council attendant on the king took a very different turn. He was charged to return to Canterbury bearing a letter to Cranmer, which he was strictly ordered not to tamper with en route. The Archbishop's evangelical agents, including Humphrey Churden, whom he had put in as incumbent at St. Alphegis in the city, had already been monitoring Serles' preaching closely. As a result, Serles found on return that Cranmer hailed the preacher up before his fellow councillors in London, and then examined the case in his own consistory court, reputedly ignoring witnesses in Serles' favor. Serles ended up in prison and was at last temporarily expelled from the 6 preachers. Meanwhile, William Hunt, alias Audley, another new prebendary from the old guard at the Cathedral Priory, he'd been a sub-prior at its dissolution, had been committed to the Fleet prison on charges whose nature now seems unclear. So far in the cathedral's first 6 months of existence, 2 of its staff had been put in prison. 2 had been the subject of a formal complaint, and 2 others had been involved in a stand-up row with their father and God. Into this promisingly explosive situation stepped Bishop Stephen Gardiner back in early October from his mission to the Emperor and the Imperial Diet, which had included face-to-face theological clashes with Cranmer's friend Osiander, his correspondence with Bucer, and the all-too-familiar Alexandria Alexius. Ever alert for trouble, Gardiner had been keeping his ears open while he was abroad, and he picked up news of Canterbury, including the imprisonment of Prebendary Hunt. His visit to the cathedral for Mass on his journey back to London was therefore slightly more than casual, and after the service, which included a sermon from Prebendary Ridley, he buttonholed Prebendary Gardiner, who a year or 2 before had taken the opportunity provided by their common surname to write to him introducing himself. The bishop asked a leading question or 2 about Canterbury stirs. Thus encouraged, the prebendary poured out his fury about the preaching of Lancelot, Ridley, and John Scory, and his own worries that he would suffer the fate of Serles. The bishop listened with gloomy relish, which one reserves for particularly shocking information, gave Gardiner some advice about preaching, and remarked with a straight-face irony, which was his specialty, "My Lord of Canterbury will look upon this, I doubt not, or else such preaching will grow into an evil inconvenience. I know well how he will see a remedy for it." Close quote. He also received a request for help from Prebendary Hunt's brother, made some detailed inquiries about the running of the cathedral, and finally took Nicholas Ridley aside for a quiet but severe talking to before passing on his way back to rejoin the politics of the capital. He'd learned much of interest for the future. However, now a startling tragedy at court for the time being suspended normal political life. The Queen was proved to be an adulteress. The whole tangled story had been told well by Lacey Baldwin Smith. Catherine Howard hugely enjoyed herself spending Henry's money, but there was one element missing in the permanent party time which she created at court after her marriage: a series of bedroom adventures with young, attractive men, which had brightened up her life as the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's home at Lambeth. Soon she summoned back her lovers to complement her hours with a large and moody husband. Her sexual liaisons became almost suicidally rash during the progress to the north. The most popular personality would have been on the road to disaster. Catherine had not cared how much enemy she made. Add to this the jealousy felt by leading aristocrats toward the Howard family for its sudden return to the king's marital circle. partly because of religious conservatism for which the Duke of Norfolk was famed, and the Queen's downfall was just a matter of time. It was perhaps inevitable that an evangelical should first take the risk of breaking the story to the authorities. He was a minor courtier, John Lascelles, on the prompting of his sister, who'd been on the edge of Catherine's raffish world. He finally revealed in October what had become obvious to many at court, that he chose to go on the most prominent evangelical in the government, Thomas Cranmer. The king and queen were still away, and the caretaker councillors, Cranmer, Audley, and Hertford, were baffled as to how and when to carry out the hideous task of telling the king. They waited until he returned in ebullient spirits to Hampton Court. Inevitably, they had decided that Cranmer was the one man who could get away with delivering Henry such a devastating personal blow. But even he could not face the task of presenting the news by word of mouth. He handed over a letter with the information at All Souls Day, 2 November. Henry had only just given thanks for his marital bliss, and his reaction was one of stunned unbelief. After so many years of mutual trust and intimate confidences from the king, Cranmer seems to have been at his best in such moments of face-to-face emotion, and he handled the situation so skillfully as to avoid any immediate explosion of royal fury in any direction. No fuss was made. Straightaway investigations of the story began with desperate urgency. This was no carefully constructed plot of destruction such as had brought down Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell. It all turned out to be true, and it was a thunderbolt which hit the king out of the clear blue sky. It was Cranmer who eventually broke Catherine's indignant denials down to an historical admission and who secured her confession in writing. After that, the details of Catherine Howard's story are hardly important. Cranmer remained at the heart of the council investigation. There remains one long letter of his written directly to the stricken Henry in November, carefully, almost clinically setting down the details of his interviews with Catherine, like an ambassador on negotiation of extreme delicacy, as he quietly probed for more evidence through her flood of tears and near insane exclamations. He also took good care to distance himself from the attempts to revive the Cleves marriage. When the ambassador of the Duke of Cleves delivered him hopeful letters from Düsseldorf, he passed the correspondence straight over to the king with some ironical comments about its personal compliments and a detailed account of his conversation with the ambassador. Cranmer emphasized to Henry that had said that he was the worst person to act as advocate for the marriage, of which I, as much as any other person, knew most just causes of divorce. He'd seen enough of Cleves' marriage negotiations to last him a lifetime. Catherine's alleged and probably actual lovers were executed in December, and she would eventually follow, along with her chief accomplice, Lord Rochford, in February 1542. Despite the origins of the revelations and the denunciation by Lascelles to Cranmer, to present the affair as an evangelical triumph is misconceived. Someone had to tell the king in the end. Catherine's behavior was so beyond the convention for a king's wife that it aroused genuine horror in her uncle the Duke as much as anyone else. Clearly, Catherine's lunatic indiscretions were not going to do the Howard family any good, but none of them suffered any permanent harm as a result of the affair. On the other side, commentators as far back as Gilbert Burnet have seen the Catherine Howard era as an era of great peril for Cranmer. The narrative events from her marriage to her death shows that this was not so in reality. We now know that she helped rather than threatened the Archbishop in the crisis of Cromwell's arrest. Thereafter, the brief flurry of conservative aggression against Cranmer's circle in the winter of 1540 and 1541 produced little result, and otherwise he was riding high throughout 1541. Catherine herself had too many trivial things on her mind to represent any religious identity, except what was conventionally on offer at court between the entertainments. The courtiers in her circle had no special conservative religious profile, and indeed they included the former right-hand man of Anne Boleyn, that veteran evangelical courtier Sir Edward Baton. Nor is it likely that the bearers of such appalling tidings of Cranmer at All Souls' Day Mass was going to get much benefit or thanks for his pains from the devastated Henry. We bring that to a close. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and Holy Ghost.